Have you ever felt like life is a puzzle where you're the only piece that doesn't quite fit? You watch others in their friend groups, their relationships, their success stories, and wonder why you feel so separate. It's not just being alone. It's that deep, gnawing sense that maybe you're not supposed to belong. What if that loneliness isn't a failure, but a sign that you're chosen for something greater? Chosen not for the easy path, but the one that's harder, quieter, more meaningful. C.S. Lewis described this kind of feeling in his writings. He said, "The weight of glory is a burden only the humble can carry. But before the glory, there's the solitude." Today we're diving into why chosen ones are often isolated, what God might be doing in your life through that loneliness, and how even the silence has a purpose. Picture a young man named Alex. Alex always had a strong sense of calling. He wanted to be a doctor. He worked hard, got into medical school, and poured his heart into his studies. But once he got there, something shifted. His classmates were more competitive than friendly, and the long hours in the library felt endless. While others formed study groups and friendships, Alex often found himself eating lunch alone, wondering, did I make a mistake? Did God really want me here? This feeling isn't unique to Alex. It's a story as old as the Bible. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness, alone with his sheep, before God spoke to him. David was anointed to be king, but spent years hiding from Saul, far from any throne. Even Jesus retreated to the wilderness before beginning his ministry. Loneliness isn't God turning his back, it's God's invitation to lean in. When you feel like no one sees you, God sees you. When it feels like no one understands, God does. And in that quiet, he prepares you. Alex didn't realize it at the time, but those lonely hours were teaching him resilience and focus, qualities he would need not just as a student, but as a doctor. Let's talk about being set apart. That phrase sounds holy, doesn't it? Like something you'd hear in church and think, oh, that's nice. But when it's your life, being set apart feels less like a blessing and more like being sidelined. Take Erin, for example. She's a high school senior who dreams of becoming an artist. She spends her weekends sketching while her friends are out at parties. They tease her for being boring, and sometimes she wonders if they're right. Why can't I just be like everyone else, she asks. C.S. Lewis wrote, "The Christian does not think God will love us because we are good, but that God will make us good because he loves us." Being set apart isn't about being better than others. It's about being refined for a purpose only you can fulfill. Think of David again. Before he became king, he was a shepherd, then a fugitive. From the outside, it probably looked like God had forgotten him. But those years weren't wasted. They were the training ground. Erin's story isn't about fitting in. It's about creating something that only she can create. Her isolation isn't a punishment. It's a gift, a space where her talent can grow without the distractions of a noisy crowd. God isn't setting her aside, he's setting her up. We live in a world that idolizes independence. You don't need anyone, the culture says. Be your own hero. But here's the problem with that. It's exhausting. Meet Jake, a tech entrepreneur. He built his startup from scratch, working 16-hour days, skipping family dinners and pouring everything into his business. On the surface, he's successful. But at night in his empty apartment, he feels the crushing weight of loneliness. He tells himself, I don't need anyone. But deep down, he knows that's not true. C.S. Lewis once said, God made us, invented us as a man invents an engine. A car is made to run on petrol, and it would not run properly on anything else. Now God designed the human machine to run on himself. Loneliness forces us to confront the lie of self-sufficiency. It's in the silence, in the spaces where we feel weakest, that we discover the strength of God. For Jake, the breakthrough came not in his work but in his surrender. One evening, after another failed deal, he found himself on his knees, praying for the first time in years. And in that moment, he realized his strength wasn't enough, but God's was. Let's talk about the hardest part of loneliness, the fear that it will never end. It's easy to look at our circumstances and think, this is my life now, this is how it will always be. But think of Emily. She's in her early 30s and has been single for years. Her friends are all married, raising kids, and she's happy for them, truly. But every holiday, every wedding she attends alone, feels like another reminder that she's still waiting. Here's where C.S. Lewis's wisdom shines brightest. He reminds us, hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny. Loneliness is a season, not a sentence. Think about Joseph. After being betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery and unjustly imprisoned, Joseph eventually rose to a position of immense power in Egypt. Pharaoh appointed him as second in command, effectively making him the governor of Egypt, because of Joseph's God-given ability to interpret dreams. Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream about an upcoming famine and proposed a plan to store food during 7 years of abundance to prepare for 7 years of scarcity. His wisdom saved countless lives. When the famine struck, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt seeking food, not realizing the powerful governor they were dealing with was the brother they had betrayed. Joseph initially tested them to see if they had changed, and when he saw their remorse, he revealed his identity. Instead of seeking revenge, he forgave them, saying, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Joseph's story ended with reconciliation, healing, and the fulfillment of God's purpose. His loneliness and suffering weren't wasted. They were part of God's plan to place him where he could save his family and an entire nation. Emily's waiting isn't wasted. During this season, she's been growing in ways she never expected, learning to rely on God, developing her passions, and building a life that isn't defined by her relationship status. One day when the season changes, she'll look back and see how God used this time to prepare her for what's next. Here's the thing. We often think of Bible stories as distant, unrelatable, but the truths they hold are timeless. Moses, David, Joseph, they were real people with real struggles, just like Sarah, Ryan, Lisa, Jake, and Emily. The common thread: God never left them alone, even when they felt isolated. Imagine a runner training for a marathon. They wake up at 5 a.m. while the world is still asleep and run miles in the dark. It's lonely, grueling, and often thankless. But when race day comes and they cross that finish line, every lonely mile makes sense. That's what loneliness can be, a training ground for something greater. Loneliness isn't easy, but it's not meaningless. It's the quiet classroom where God teaches us to hear his voice. It's the refining fire that shapes us into who we're meant to be. If you feel alone right now, remember this: you're not forgotten. You're being prepared. C.S. Lewis said, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains." Loneliness is his megaphone. It's his way of calling you closer, of setting you apart for something extraordinary. You're not alone, you're set apart. And chosen ones, they're never truly alone. God is with you, even in the silence, especially in the silence.